For Simon Peter and all who were with him were amazed at the catch of fish that they had taken. And so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. Then Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on you will be catching people." When they had brought their boats to the shore, they had left everything and followed Jesus. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
How shall I say it? Of a certain age, like mine, might remember the beautiful apostolic exhortation offered to the Church by Pope John Paul II in 1996, entitled Tertio Millennio Adveniente, on the coming of the third millennium. It was written several years before the turn of the millennium because, as you may recall, there were 3 years of prayerful preparation prior to the year 2000, in which we were invited to reflect on where we had come from in terms of the advancement of the faith and where we were headed. And in that document, His Holiness St. John Paul II laid out a program for the Church for the third millennium. And at the beginning of that document, he chose a magnificent passage from the Gospel, which set the tone, and still is the tone, for the third millennium, even though we are already into it nearly a quarter of the ways. And that Gospel passage was the one that you have just heard proclaimed. And it came to be known at that time as the message for the Church of putting out into the deep waters. And it was a very powerful message. Like most Gospel passages, this one too is multi-layered in meaning. Here is what we understood when Pope John Paul II addressed the message put out into the deep waters to the whole Church, the universal Church. And he emphasized this point, that in the third millennium, we will need to discover ever more deeply what is meant by the call to evangelize. And in doing so, we will need to discover new and more effective ways of evangelizing our church and indeed ourselves as individuals and as members of the church. It was an exciting exhortation because it began to stir thought, and new ways of evangelizing for the world in which we live began to evolve. Although it is a matter of opinion, some will say that the methods that evolved during the pandemic were indeed new models of evangelization for the world. Not everyone would agree, but they were new models because for long periods of time we were not permitted to enter the churches in great numbers or at all. There is another way of looking at this same exhortation, and it is to look upon it on the individual level. put out into the deep waters. And that message can speak to us beautifully and powerfully about our own call to put out into the deep waters where there is an abundance of fish. A beautiful symbolic story encouraging us to evangelize ourselves ever more deeply, to live the gospel, to embrace the gospel, and to live the beauty and the richness of the gospel message as an example to those who do not appreciate it. After all, no one is going to be attracted to a faith if they don't see benefit in it for themselves. And that is legitimate benefit. They need to see beauty, benefits, and attractiveness, as we have all discovered in our own life. And we need to give witness to the joy of the gospel living, as well as the challenges of the gospel living in the world today. So the Holy Father at that time was encouraging us not to be afraid to put out into dangerous, deep waters, but to take a risk. In other words, to trust in God, and in God's providential care, and in His guidance of us as individuals, as well as members of the broader universal church. It was a message that stirred many people. We don't know to what degree the message has borne fruit, but we trust that even if we can't always see the fruit of the Holy Spirit, we trust that it is there. But it is also appropriate for us to hear the message once more, put out into the deep waters of life. Him at this Mass. In honoring Him, of course, we are honoring Jesus Christ. As you are aware, Saint Josemaria offered to the Church a new method of holiness. And his teaching was rooted in the principle, or one of the principal teachings of the Second Vatican Council, which occurred between the years 1962 and 1965. Universal call to holiness. At the present time, we might not think of that call as particularly startling. At the time, however, I recall my parish priest preaching on it. I was a very young child, but I had a good memory. And he pointed out that something that was startling at the time, that holiness is the call of every single baptized person. We really didn't have that awareness prior to the Second Vatican Council. For many of us thought that holiness was only the call of the priests and the religious, the priests and the religious sisters. For other people, so it was rather startling when we learned that ministry is not just for those who are the particular professional religious, so to speak, the priests and the nuns, but it is the responsibility of everyone who is baptized. I don't think the message has caught on fully yet. People still think that even though they are baptized, that their role is not to grow in holiness, because it is beyond them anyway, and that their role is to obey, pray, and pay. That is sad. It takes a long time for a fundamental teaching of the Church to be appropriated by everyone. Saint Josemaria offered to the world, especially but not exclusively to the laity, the call to holiness. And his holiness, his call to holiness, can be said to have sprung from today's gospel passage, but also the call to holiness was a very simple message, at least a message simple to hear, but not always simple to understand, or to integrate, or to live. And his message was, make the best of the ordinary circumstances of everyday life, in your family life, at work, in the marketplace, wherever, to live the authentic values of the Christian life as fully as possible. And in that way, living those values and trusting that God will permit us to live them, that we will grow in holiness. And that has been proven and true by the example and witness of countless people around the world, in many countries, who have lived according to the teaching of Saint Josemaria. This is the call to each one of us. It is a call, as you are aware, I'm sure, that is simple. And in some ways, it can be misinterpreted. We know that we live in a very secular and hostile world. A world that is hostile to our faith and to our church. We know that because people who are absorbing and integrating into themselves the values of the secular world do not respect the values of the Christian faith. And they will call us foolish, as believers in myths, as outdated and as old-fashioned and as irrelevant. And of course, the trump card is to try to silence anyone who articulates a message of Christian value. Because if you silence a person, then you don't have to listen to them. And you can proceed with your own secular beliefs and theories. So people might say, no, we need to be quite active and confrontational against the values of the secular world, if you could call them values at all. Saint Josemaria offered a method that was effective and yet not exactly confrontational, but effective, because it follows the example of Jesus Christ. So unlike the people of the Crusades in the Middle Ages, who have seen the Crusades, rightly or wrongly, as simply methods of killing the non-Christians, we do not accept that message, because it is not the message of Christ. As Christ hung on the cross, dying, he said, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. He did not pull over to the side of himself, St. John the Apostle, and say, John, you know that I have been unjustly crucified. Here's what I want you to do. After my death, go home. Make a list of all those people who have treated me unjustly, and then go out and kill them. That was far, far, far from the teaching of Jesus. In the method of holiness prescribed by St. Josemaria, he asks us to reflect on the teaching of Jesus, the values of the gospel, to live them authentically and yet quietly, without a whole lot of words, relying on the value of our witness, our authentic witness, which flows from a well-formed Christian conscience in such a way that we will evangelize ourselves and the world through our witness and our example. our testimony. Certainly, words may be helpful, but we do not need to destroy those who are the perceived enemies, but rather to love them and to pray for them. Our work is aimed at living out of a good, well-formed Christian conscience, aimed for what the Church calls the common good, and living in trust, based on the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, that in the end, God and good will triumph over sin and death. For us who are believers, that is the foundation of our hope in every circumstance of every life, regardless of the difficulty of the circumstances. Here's why. No one but God can raise anyone from the dead. Only God can do that. Not even Satan can do that. And in raising Jesus from the dead, God the Father, through the power of the Holy Spirit, brought Jesus from his earthly death back to life. And it demonstrated for us, and still does demonstrate, that God is more powerful than Satan. God is more powerful than evil, of sin, and of death. For we believe that as baptized Christians, we are bonded to Jesus Christ, and as he rose from the dead, so too shall we.